डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर ओपन युनिव्हर्सिटी.
Namaskar students, I Dr. Jaini Shah, Assistant Professor English, welcome you all to the video lecture series from Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University. Friends, in the series of video lectures, especially of second year Bachelor of Arts in English subject, today we are going to deal with paper number 3, that is History of English Literature, and in that I am going to take up unit number 2, which is titled as Difference between Empirical and Literary Study of the History of English Literature. Friends, this session is like a precursor, because before we move on to study the various ages in the history of English literature, which you already know by now, for example, Elizabethan age, Puritan age, Augustan age, Romantic age, modern age, etc., so on and so forth. The objective of this session is to explain you the importance of the study of history of English literature, as in why it is important to study the history of literature. The second objective is to discuss the difference between empirical study and literary study of the history of English literature. Friends, before we move further, in the title, as you may know by now, there is a word called empirical. Now, what do we mean by this word? Friends, empirical, EMPIRICAL, empirical is something which is based on observation and experience rather than theory and pure logic. An empirical study is the analysis of the data which is based on direct observation or experiences of the concerned field. You will gain more clarity regarding the empirical study in the due course. Friends, in this session, the components for discussion are the introduction to the topic, that is some overview on the need to study history, need to study history of English literature, characteristics of empirical study of the history of English literature, as well as characteristics of literary study of the history of English literature. And further, by knowing the characteristics of both the fields, we are going to know about the differences that exist between empirical history and literary history of English literature, and then we go onward to the conclusion. So friends, let us begin with the introduction to the topic. Friends, the study of history provides accounts and insights from the past. By the word history, we mean past. Any history, be it the history of cultures, nations, civilizations or events, it includes all the aspects of life. Various aspects such as, you can say, religion, culture, education, politics, economy, monarchy, society, even arts, literature, so on and so forth. Each culture has particular ways of preserving or storing its history and heritage. For example, largely the Western culture, the West has documented its history in the written documents, whereas the Eastern culture the eastern countries like India has preserved its past through oral literatures as well as manuscripts. Like nations and civilizations, literature too has its own history. When we study the history of literature, what are we studying? We are studying the cultural memory of a particular nation and its people. When we study the history of English literature, we come across a variety of books written in and about the past centuries. Some books focus on the archaeological evidence, such as handwritten scripts of the authors, their monumental things, places they had been, universities where they studied, or the places where they wrote these books, etc. These aspects form the empirical study of history of English literature. Whereas there are other various books which give us a brief account of writers and their works during different periods of history. And when we study this history, that study is called the literary study of the history of English literature. Friends, now let us come to understand that why one studies history at all, why there is need to study the events that have passed by. Friends, history is studied for various purposes, for various reasons. Someone studies history to know what existed in the past. Some other persons studies history of a particular subject to examine the present scenario of that particular subject. So, the present can be examined through the past which existed, and that can be the reason to study history. Some other people study history because they are interested in studying that, they are curious to know about the events that are that happened in the past. So, likewise there are various purposes to study history. Friends, when someone studies history, he or she systematically examines different aspects of the past. It is about critically analyzing past events for the betterment of the present as well as the future. However, why is it important to study something that has gone by? So, the study of history is as important as a person's memory. Friends, imagine you lended some money to your friend and then you forget it. What will happen? Chances are that probably you will lose the money if your friend also forgets to return it. Or suppose that accidentally you fell into a pit yesterday in the market. Today you are going again through the same path and you forget yesterday's incident. What will happen? Chances are that you will fall again. But to remember what is useful and what is harmful, memory plays a very important role. We need to use memory. Among all the species, only the human beings could cultivate dynamic memory. However, human memory is still very limited. So, when we want to remember something useful for the ages to come, for the generations to follow, we need to find out ways and means of remembering this. And therefore, we write books, we build monuments, we sing songs of legends, and we tell stories of their glories, so that through the history of the events, legends, nations, civilizations, the history is preserved and stored in these forms for the generations to come, so that they can know it and cherish it. Now let us proceed further. Let us now come to understand that why do we study history of literature. We know that history is important, but why we study history of literature? Friends, there are many things which cannot be documented by the systematic means of history. For example, monuments and books. Therefore, we need to look at other ways of remembering the past. For example, an excellent work of literature of a particular period can very well tell us about the people of that time with their beliefs, customs, virtues, vices, ideology, social structures, economic structures, etc. Now, the study of the history of English literature allows us to understand the culture and English society that existed in the Britain of that time. There are various reasons why the study of the history of English literature is significant. The first reason is, as you can see, we can see the development of the English language during various phases of history and how different authors have contributed to the development of grammar, vocabulary and language, that is English. The second reason is it allows us to understand literary, philosophical and ideological movements which were prevalent in the past. Thirdly, it gives us a comprehensive picture of different art forms as well as people's tastes for the same. Lastly, the fourth reason is the study of literary forms such as poems, stories, novels, plays and essays make us understand how English culture has developed into what it is today. So, the past helps us understand the present. The concepts of empirical study and literary study of the history of English literature can be better understood by knowing the characteristics of both the studies. So, we proceed forward to that. Now, friends, let us start first with the characteristics of empirical study of the history of English literature, or you may call it features of empirical study of the history of English literature. Friends, as you know now, history is a story of the truth of the past. How do we know that whatever is written in the history books is the truth? Well, the simple answer to this question is there is empirical evidence that supports the factual truths of the past events. Empirical evidence means evidence that can be seen, touched and measured. It can be seen, touched and measured. Whatever data or information is available to the historian is analyzed and interpreted to verify the truth. Let us take an example. We find references to Globe Theatre of Shakespearean age, which is about 400 years from now. Do we know that was it actually there? How do we know? So, an empirical study of such data will take you to the location. When you visit the Globe Theatre, you would like to match the details given in the history books with what you observe at that place. When the details are comparable, you can find the parallels and you can relate it, we may believe that the information provided in the books is correct. But what if you do not find the Globe Theatre in actuality? Then, as an empirical historian, one should study the remains of the theatre, both physical and non-physical. For example, one can study books written before 300 years ago to check out whether there was any description of a theatre like that, whether Globe Theatre existed. Then one can also study books written before 200 years and then before 100 years. Likewise, one can come to know precisely to what time the theatre was functional and where it existed and how did it function. One can also study the records maintained by the theatre, such as the details of the actors, dramatists, patronages, directors, helpers, their salaries, expenditures of the overall theatre, etc. So, with these information, one can find out the authenticity of Globe Theatre. One can also meet present day successors of the people who were associated with the Globe Theatre, and one can try to know from them when they share the stories, for they might have preserved the story of the Globe Theatre in their oral memory from generations to come. Besides, one can study the books written by the archaeologists or folklorists or literary historians, etc. So, there are various ways to find out whether the theatre existed. The function of an empirical study of history is to find out measurable proofs that claim certain things about the past. Thus, based on the above example, we deduce the following, or we understand the following characteristics of an empirical study of the history of English literature. The first one being, empirical study of history of English literature studies scientific and historical evidences or proofs of books, authors and events of the past. The second reason is, or the feature characteristic is, that empirical study is highly objective in nature, means it is the representation of the facts. Subjectivity is not involved in empirical study. The third reason is, it includes more than one source of evidences. So, there are various proofs to prove something. The fourth characteristic is, the evidences should give almost the same conclusion to other historians too, because what is fact is going to remain the fact. Now, knowing these characteristics, let us move forward to know the literary study of the history of English literature. Friends, the literary study of the history of English literature, unlike empirical study, focuses on the literary tastes of English society. For example, the lives of the poets, lives of the authors and playwrights of particular periods, the activists, social people, intelligentsia, etc. In a literary study, the historian studies different periods in history. For example, Elizabethan age, Restoration age, the Puritan age, etc. Moreover, what kind of literary genres were popular in what age, this is also studied. Who were the leading poets and writers? What were the major themes and styles that were popular? Why were some literary trends more dominant than others? These are some of the questions or some of the areas that a literary historian explores in his or her study. Also, some landmark literary works can be studied to know about the social customs, rituals, practices which were prevalent during that particular age in the history. For example, when we study David Deutsch's work called A Critical History of English Literature, when we studied, we find out a chronology of ages of English literature and discussion. We also find discussion on the impact of socio-political aspects of the creative writers. And to support his argument, Deutsch includes examples of poems, verses of poems, excerpts and passages of prose works with publication details of the books. In all, we find that such books focus more on three aspects. First aspect is information, which includes what was written in terms of prose, poetry, drama, novels, etc. The second aspect is the context, that is, the socio-political scenario of that time, of that age. And the third aspect is on the style, which focuses on how literature was written. For example, its genres, themes, subject matter, language, styles, symbols, motifs, trends, etc. A literary study of English literature, of history of English literature, mostly includes books as sources of evidence. The conclusions derived from the fictional and non-fictional books are more of interpretations than of scientific statements. Scientific statements are a part of empirical study, whereas they are not a part of literary study. Therefore, each literary historian has a different viewpoint about the same author, about the same event, or about the same trend of the history of English literature. Thus, based on this view, we can deduce the following characteristics of the literary study of history of English literature. The first characteristic is literary study of history of English literature gives description of the general literary tastes of the English society of past years. So, in the book it is described how was their day-to-day life and what they liked or disliked. Second feature is the focus of such a study is to generalize whether literary periods, movements and impacts were socially relevant or not. The third characteristic is it includes fictional and non-fictional books as the sources of study. The fourth aspect is the outcome of such a study is often an interpretation of the literary events of the past. So, it is not based on scientific observations, logic and experiments, etc. Now, let us see some of the key differences between the empirical history and literary history of English literature. So, after knowing the characteristic, we move on to know the differences. So, the idea becomes clearer to you. Friends, between both the types of historical studies, that is the empirical study and literary study, the difference lies in the 6 tools, that is aim, approach, procedure, focus, tools and outcomes of the study. Now, let us see how that happens. Friends, the aim of empirical history is to find out the factual truths of the history of English literature. For example, was there actually a Globe Theatre, or did something exist like Globe Theatre? Whereas the literary history aims to find out the chronological development of literary aspects of history of English literature. For example, how Globe Theatre contributed to the development of English drama, how Shakespeare made Globe Theatre famous. Now, the second difference is in the approach of these studies. Empirical history is highly scientific in its approach. For example, the study of the original manuscripts of William Shakespeare is the focus of empirical study, whereas the literary, in order to establish the authenticity of Shakespeare's works, this takes place in empirical study, whereas the literary history is highly narrative in its approach. The literary study focuses on the study of themes of dramas or plays written by William Shakespeare. Friends, the third difference is in the procedure of both empirical and literary study of history of English literature. Empirical history uses systematic procedure which is based on empirical sources, which can be say for example documents of Shakespeare's birth, income, letters written by him to someone else, contracts signed by him for dramatis, drama, etc. Whereas on the contrary, literary history of the same uses descriptive procedure which is based on the books which are fictional and non-fictional. For example, literary study will focus more on books of Shakespeare by examining the dramatic techniques, criticism of his plays, studying the characters produced by Shakespeare, etc. Further, both the histories have different purpose or focus. The empirical history focuses on answering specific questions such as, did Shakespeare actually write the drama called Hamlet? Whereas the same is not with the literary history. The literary history focuses to answer general questions such as, who were the major playwrights of the Elizabethan era, or we come to Shakespeare, then what were the genres in which he wrote, what was their writing style, which subject matters or themes were prevalent in Elizabethan age. These come under the literary study of the history of English literature. Whereas the fifth aspect is the tool. Empirical history uses, as we know, measurable tools such as archaeological evidences, books, photographs. For example, Shakespeare's writing desk, his home or the place where he wrote, his folios, etc. On the other hand, the literary history focuses on tools again, but the tools are different, like words, poems, stories, plays, novels, history books which are available on William Shakespeare. For example, as you know, Hamlet, Macbeth, The Merchant of Venice, the Shakespeare Survey, A History of English Literature, so on and so forth. Friends, now we come to the last difference between the two studies, which is the outcome. Since the methods are different, the outcome is also going to be different. In empirical history, the end result is testable and verifiable. For example, the same result of the study of Shakespeare in relation to his folios or publications, whether they belong to him or not, though at times the results are contested, but we can say that the result is going to be the same or constant. Whereas on the other hand, in the literary history, the end result is subject to multiple interpretations. For example, Shakespeare's dramas, different interpretations of the study of Shakespeare's characters in the dramas that he wrote. So, it depends on the literary historian that what interpretation he gains from the dramas of Shakespeare. So friends, with the above session and information and the matter, we can conclude that the significant difference between the empirical study of history of English literature and the literary study of the history of English literature exists in the goal and method of the respective studies. We should remember that both kind of studies are essential for the students of English literature. In fact, a good history of English literature will give you some empirical evidence too, as well as literary evidence. Mostly, the study of the history of English literature will enable you to understand English literature, that is English poems, plays, stories, novels, essays, etc. in a far better manner, because history provides the context, background in which different genres were written in the past. So friends, in this session you have known of the importance of study of history of English literature, and along with that the various characteristics of empirical study of history of English literature as well as literary study of history of English literature. And along with that, with knowing the differences that exist between the two studies, the understanding, I hope, has been clarified and it has been bettered. Now friends, here are some of the questions which are based on the which are based on this session, and they are as a part of your self assessment exercise. So you may try to answer these questions because they are taken from the topic itself, and it will be easier for you to understand the concept better. And further, here are some of the references, and so you may refer to these books for further reading, and below are the links taken from the open source of the internet. So you may go there and you may follow those links and you may read more on this topic. So friends, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope it has helped you understand the concept better, and goodbye until next time.
स्वाध्यायः परमम्